Okay, so welcome everyone to the fifth episode of Expert Speak, brought to you by Creators of Products. Today we have Sidhu Bonappa from Gojek with us. Sidhu has worked in the Indian tech industry, both services and products, for a decade and a half. And during this period, he has held a couple of jobs, but mostly he has been co-founding. He has co-founded four startups. Sidhu has worked as an engineer, product manager, salesperson, recruiter, marketer, CTO, and a CEO. He says that he has failed more times than he can count. His most recent startup was acquired by Gojek in 2015. And since then, he has played an incredible role in scaling both the company as well as the team. Today, Sidhu will share the crazy growth story that Gojek has seen. So without taking any more of time, I will hand it over to one of the sharpest tech minds in India, Sidhu.
Thanks so much, DK. Thanks everyone for being here. This is a new talk that I'm working on. So, you get to be my test subjects. There's certain aspects of it that I think it'll be very valuable for me to talk to you in terms of the Q&A to flesh out. But thank you for being here and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I know DK has built a fantastic community. I've been watching over the last few months and it's really nice to be here. So without further ado, let's dive straight in. What I'm trying to put together here is a
Can you
talk.
get your mic closer? People are pinging that.
Yeah, sorry, I've not got a replacement mic and I'm stuck with this old mic that's not really working. So bear with me, I'm going to hold it up like this. Is this better, DK?
Yes, this is much better.
Super. So the focus of this talk was things I learned, especially in the first 2 or 3 years of Gojek. There's a large element of if I had to do it over again to this. Some of these things I learned by studying. Most of them I learned from watching my colleagues who all, had to solve these problems in different ways, and I happily stole from them. This is biased towards my areas in when I was working on on Gojek India's problems. So this is not meant to be a general all problems of business starting up, etc., but biased towards the stuff that I worked on. It's also biased towards a startup that was surviving growth. At that time, the market was throwing more growth at us than we could possibly deal with, and these are the problems that came with that domain. And I also want to call out that most of what I'm going to talk about is actually quite obvious. The real problem tends to be in how do you actually operationalize it. And I will try to do my utmost to give some concrete tips on practical things you can do to operationalize the advice. But I'm always happy to dig deeper into those aspects in the Q&A or conversation post this talk. So a little bit more context. This was just to give you a sense of the scale we were dealing with at the time, right? So we're talking about the lifespan of Gojek from Feb 2015 at launch to roughly around Feb 2018 when Shailendra put this tweet out. And at the time, we were looking at an organization of about, say, 500 people in product, including engineers, designers, everything. Of course, company operations was substantially larger. We must have been 2,000 or 3,000 people at the time. But the actual delivery organization was sub 500 people and engineering was about 300 across 3 countries. So that's to give you a sense of the scale and context we were dealing with. Also, I want to call out that this advice is intended to address growth pains. And I want to share how I categorize that upfront because that context is important. Broadly speaking, I think it's useful to look at the growth of the business or the organization in terms of family, tribe, and city, because I find it useful to reason with that analogy. A family is a size where everybody knows everybody else. Everybody recognizes everybody else's feelings just by looking at them. You know each other well enough that, if someone is not doing well or is struggling with something or is very happy about something happened, everyone in the company knows, right? By the time you get to a tribe, it's multi-family. You know everybody, but you don't necessarily know everything about them. You're dependent on intermediaries to bring information to you. but nobody is a stranger. And a city size is large enough where increasingly you run into strangers. So roughly speaking, this is the slicing that I'm looking at. Most of what I'm talking about is in the transition from tribe to city, right? That transition where you go from a small tight-knit team where every name is familiar to a large organization where you engage on top of roles and levels. That's kind of the window. There are also two abstract areas I'm going to cover. I wanted to do three, but I've cut it short. We can do it in Q&A. At the abstract, I wanted to talk about alignment, execution, and hiring. Hiring I've left out for now. We can, there are some things there that I can talk about post in Q&A. So, given this context, let's talk about this a little more. Why given this opportunity, am I picking alignment, right? For me, alignment is number one. Alignment is the term that we use to make sure that everyone is on the same page, that everyone agrees that any disagreements on any particular aspect have been resolved or parked. Alignment is a term that I only learned as we scaled up. It entered my vocabulary sometime in 2016. Now, the reason why this is number one is without alignment, you can't scale execution. If you can't scale execution, you can't scale hiring. You can't do anything else. Like everything comes downstream from execution. Execution is downstream to alignment. So for me, I think the number one takeaway, something I would really prioritize if I had to do this again, was to spend a lot more time and effort on how we align. Now, the context for why this was such a pain and why this was so important is at the time we were seeing our transaction volumes doubling every 2 to 3 weeks. We had distributed teams and we had language barriers. So, you're looking at, having to continue to deliver while, your organization is not doubling, thank God, every 2 to 3 weeks, but the business is. Now, I think the first thing that's worth figuring out a system for is alignment on outcomes, right? What is it that we all want to see happen? What is the business end result? The second thing that alignment breaks down on is priorities. Sure, we want these end results, but what do we all agree is the most important among them? What is the order of importance, right? Again, nothing original here, but now I really begin to understand why so much of the literature places so much emphasis on this. Next, alignment on sequencing. What do we all agree is urgent, right? Which is not necessarily the same thing as important, right? It may not be strategically important for the business, but if there is a compliance that the government has issued, then it's urgent and you have to do it, right? Alignment on trade-offs. Getting on the same page about, in order to do this thing that we consider important or this thing that we consider urgent or both, what are we willing to give up? Because the bitter truth is when you are in a fast growth situation, the direct corollary of that is you're also in extreme scarcity. Like you're short on talent, you're short on people, you're short on money, you're short on time. Literally everything else is bottlenecked because the market is throwing so much demand at you. So being clear what you're willing to give up and everyone being on the same page about that is also extremely challenging and important. Now, having said all of this, let's talk a little bit about what this actually means on the ground. So far, so good. I don't think anyone would necessarily disagree, but the theory is fine. What's the praxis? How do we actually do this? And of course, there is no one answer, right? Alignment in an organization that's growing is a very complex and nuanced thing. But if there was one thing, it would be writing. I think over this period, there are several things that changed at Gojek as we adapted to our situation. And one thing that has come through very, very, very clearly is this massive shift to written communication. I think the COVID crisis has simply accelerated this and sort of put a very sharp point of urgency to this. But even before that, there was a very clear trend where we could see alignment rate and quality of alignment improve, where people were starting to shift to writing. Now, the question I think that's worth talking about here is, what is it that writing does that adds this value, that makes this possible? And all too often, people talk about other stuff, but if you ask me, I think there is a level of clarity that comes out when you are writing that no amount of speaking can match. And I'm not sure I understand why. This is deductive reasoning, but I have found this to be true about myself and others consistently over time. So my best guess is there's a hardware issue at play here. Like human beings just function this way. And you know, I think it's equally important to emphasize that all too often when we talk, like I grew up hating the idea of documentation, right, in my career, like looking down on documentation as a symbol of inefficient bureaucracy. And while that is true only on the failure mode of this approach, right? And I was not exposed, I mean, I was not thinking about it that way, though I was exposed to the success mode, right? So, but I want to call out this is very important. This is not about, it's just not about creating paper trails, right? This is about clarity. I can't emphasize this enough. I want to make sure that I'm directly addressing the stigma that written documentation has as being a messy artifact of a bureaucracy, right? Um, Writing is a two-edged sword, and I absolutely will, agree that one edge of it is bad and it can produce all of these unusable documents where people just talk about shipping documents and no actual work gets done. But the other edge of the sword is very useful, and we should not throw both sides out, right? The other edge is what allows us to scale. It gives us such a beautiful tool, and you know we need to make sure that we appreciate that aspect of it. Now, given that alignment needs clarity, something about the whole situation was a blind spot in myself, which was that the entire time I was looking down on documentation, I was also a part of open source teams that only communicated in writing. Like, I don't ever remember getting on a call. Face to face was never in the context of the open source work itself. It just happened maybe if we ran into each other at a conference, maybe. Like, it wasn't a work related face to face meeting. And yet, following this kind of an approach, the whole internet has been built, right? Like, there is thousands of people or tens of thousands of people over 4 decades who've built all of the infrastructure that powers the internet, mostly by talking to each other and writing. So ironically, even though I was blind to this reality while using it, I think other experiences in Gojek gradually surfaced this to me. And going back to the skills and habits I had built on an open source team, it turns out, have really served me well in areas outside of engineering as well. Now, again, let's go on. Now, what does this mean for you if you buy my argument and you say, hey, what are the things I can do in my workplace, in my organization to help drive writing? Now, this is practical advice that works for me, YMMV. One thing I found to be phenomenally useful is a 50 WPM type rate. Like, all too often, the reason people don't write is because they can't write as fast as they think. And what I found was that 50 WPM, you're roughly able to keep up with your thoughts, and that makes writing smooth. Now, none of this is original. The 50 WPM type rate argument was one that came from engineering, where we found that people. I used to have a terrible type rate. I used to do like 15, 16, 17 WPM because I had picked up very bad typing habits as a kid. And it was a constant source of complaint from people who were working closely with me, pairing with me in the first few years of my career, that it was painful because I couldn't type fast enough. And I myself found it painful because I couldn't type fast enough to keep up with my own thoughts. And then at some point, I made the switch. And because I've been on the before and after, I can strongly advocate for this. If you don't already have a 50 WPM type rate personally, or you do not have a culture of effective typing in your organization, you see people poking keys around or doing that funny stuff with their fingers, address this upfront. The second thing was brought in by another colleague of mine, which is the silent meeting format. If you just Google this, you'll find plenty of material around this. But this was game changing. What silent meetings ensured is that, one, nobody shows up for a meeting unprepared anymore because you show up for the meeting and you read. Second, you no longer have a bottleneck on who is talking. Right? All too often, the most forceful person or the person most prone to talking And, given that I'm in the latter category sometimes and the former category at other times, being on both sides, I could see that in meetings where earlier I didn't feel heard, I now felt heard. And I could also see that in other meetings where I would never felt that, I wasn't heard, but I felt participation was low, participation jumped. So I can't advocate this strongly enough. The third thing, and I think this is an egregious fault in most organizations, which is the creation of discussion groups that are not moderated. Now, culturally, from open source, there was never a communication channel that did not have clear on-topic, off-topic rules, and that was not actively moderated. If you consistently violated the rules, you would get a warning, and then you would get kicked. End of discussion. Yet, in organizations where communication is such a challenge and driving alignment is such a challenge, you almost never see a strictly moderated discussion group. Now, it doesn't matter whether this is on chat or whether this is on email, that's orthogonal. But one operational thing that I would advocate for is every decision-making or execution group in your organization, whether it's on email or chat, should be actively moderated with a clear set of on-topic, off-topic notes published at the top. The next suggestion is the wiki as a state of reality. I have this both for alignment and execution in slightly different ways. But over time, I've become a massive fan of, as a manager, my primary artifact being the wiki. Right? The team wiki is where, I treat that as the code that I'm writing that runs the team. Right? Sure, it's not in code, it's in English or what have you. But everything that is being done, everything that people need to know, whether they're joining the team new or on the team for a while, every operational process, every RFC, every RCA, every single thing that contributes to understanding the current state of the project must be maintained in the wiki in a usable format. The wiki should be tracked and measured for active use. The next thing that I found very useful, which we've been doing for a few years now, is bake writing into all training. So even our engineering, like our grad onboarding, has a very clear writing component where you've got to produce a certain amount of content every day for no reason other than to get comfortable with writing. And last, I think this is a question that I frequently get asked, which is, hey, how is it that you folks manage to ship so many blogs? And, why is it so hard? This is one of the hardest challenges. And the reason why shipping strong, deep product and engineering content is so hard is because there is no culture of writing to underpin it. Like if you're in a situation where you've tried to bootstrap for recruiting reasons, marketing reasons, a blog and run into a wall, you may want to go look at the underlying culture of writing and attack the problem there rather than attacking it as a blogging or content problem. So these are some of my operational suggestions in order to drive alignment. Now, of course, there is the bigger stuff that I'm not talking about, which I think is self-evident, so I've skipped through, which is, of course, you need to have clear goals. I mean, you need a framework around it. Like we've used OKRs, but I don't think I'm super fussed what it needs to be, but it needs to be there. But aside from that, assuming that you already have your goals sorted, these would be the specific steps that I would suggest around written alignment. The next aspect of alignment that I want to talk about is alignment through org design. Just super beware Conway's law. The thing about fast-growing organizations is because of the somewhat decentralized nature of things, you will have teams and groups being evolved and structured in complete isolation from the operations and the architecture. And this will come back to bite you. Because at the end of the day, how you separate, and these need to be very intentional decisions. Do you have a front end and a back end team separate? How do you slice business and product? How do you slice the relationship between operations support and engineering support? Where do those boundaries get drawn? How do those teams get formed? How do you compose those teams? What is the functions that are represented in each of those teams? All of these need to be extremely thoughtfully done, because otherwise you think you're making a staffing decision, but actually you're changing the architecture. Or you think you're making an architectural decision and suddenly you realize that your staffing is completely messed up, and suddenly you need to hire 30 more people just because you've changed the architecture there. Now, just putting Conway's Law out there for those who haven't seen this before, I strongly recommend just picking up the Wikipedia article and running through it. But the TLDR of this is your organization structure and your the systems that their organization builds, which is your software, your processes, your support, whatever, are tightly coupled. You can't touch one without touching the other, right? Now, given this reality, here are some guidelines that have been, proven useful to me over time. Make sure that you try to design teams so that there is always skin in the game. Now, some of the common areas that I see this start to become a challenge is the creation of platform teams, where the people on the platform team get isolated from the end customer. And the consumer-facing teams get isolated from what is being evolved on the core. Specialist teams, where you create teams of front end or back end or security or what have you, right? Database, whatever. And the last area of risk is where you segregate output and outcome, right? Like where output is the work you do, outcome is the business result. Now, output-outcome boundaries, I think, are especially nuanced. I'll give you a concrete example of this. The specific question over here would be, at what level of seniority and in what roles in your organization does someone get P&L responsibility? Because P&L responsibility is the most direct example of being responsible for an outcome, right? Do you have to be a senior engineer, or do you have to be a head of engineering, or do you need to be a C-level before you start becoming accountable for P&L and budgets, right? Similarly for product. Again, if you look at the distinction between business and product, where, again, does the product manager have a P&L say or not? Does the business person have an uptime metric or not? Now, I'm not saying there is a right or a wrong answer. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm saying is these calls need to be made very, very intentionally, and you constantly need to pick and choose where you draw the boundary to ensure that all teams have some skin in the game, right? The second thing that I learned from watching my colleagues is design the architecture to reduce team dependencies. So one of the reasons we moved to Kafka during this time period, which is an event-based architecture, was we were very clearly seeing all the teams start to bottleneck each other on top of APIs. Now, synchronous API integration starts creating dependencies. Don't look to solving that problem any way other than through architecture first. If there isn't an architectural solution, then maybe consider other things. But if you start to see blockages, interdependencies start to build up, first go look at your architecture, because it's probable that there is something in your system architecture that is causing the problem, right? People are bottlenecking around access to APIs, access to data warehouses, what have you. Now, that's my piece on alignment. Let me move on to the second part of this three-part conversation, which is execution, right? This is the worst and best part about this section is that there is already so much material on this, but I'll keep this brief and then point you to the material, right? So the distinction I'm making over here is execution is whatever produces output, where output does not necessarily translate to a business outcome, right? But what I mean by this is, just because the code went to production doesn't mean your conversion rate went up or revenue went up or anything else that matters to the business happened, right? Now, a simpler way of thinking about it would be, this is the difference between what we did and what actually happened. And it's also important to call out that the connection between output and outcome is always somewhat tenuous. You always end up with a hypothesis. In many cases, the challenge is the hypothesis cannot meaningfully be verified. But at the end of the day, there's almost never a clear, direct, obvious connection between output and outcome, because outcome is always affected by 1,000 other factors, including market realities, externalities, stuff like that. Now, if you want to scale outcome, there are two ways outcome scale. One is, of course, the market is throwing scale at you, and the other is you are scaling your output, right? And you're scaling your output in a manner that that is hinging on the correct hypotheses, and this gives you better and better business results, better growth. Now, this, I think, is one of the hardest problems in our profession, because if you want to scale output, you need to measure output. And you are talking about measuring things like the productivity of a team. And our industry is just littered with examples of picking the wrong metric and destroying everything, right? There's always this apocryphal story of this oil company that decided to measure productivity through lines of code. And so, of course, the engineers wrote more and more lines of code. And of course, everything stopped working, right? Like, I don't know if that story is true or not, but how do we measure output and how do we scale output is a hard problem. And because it is this hard to decide what the metric is, we ignore it, right? The second thing that's hard about it is, how do you instrument this? Like, if I want to know what is the productivity of an engineering team, how do I instrument the workflow, both in terms of the flow itself, as well as operationally in terms of the process that the team follows, to make sure that execution metrics are coming out? This is also insanely hard. Like, this is an operations discipline process problem of non-trivial proportion. Now, the combination of these two things means that while there is growth, both get ignored. But by the time you need to start pulling on these levers, it is often too late, and you have a lot of organization, team, systems, code in place, and now making changes too hard. So, if, in the spirit of things that I would do differently, I would spend a lot of time and effort trying to figure out how to instrument execution so that I would have some metrics around it. Now, scaling, what does this mean in terms of operational steps? Theory is fine, right? And this is where I'm sorry, I get a little tongue in cheek. There are textbooks on the topic, right? The two textbooks that I would definitely suggest off the top of my head would be Reinertsen's Principles of Product Development Flow, which is one of the most advanced books I've come across on the topic, again, recommended to me by colleagues. And the second would be The Mythical Man Month, which is pretty much, the original textbook on software project management. Now, the number of times that I run into a conversation around execution optimization at a conference or online, wherever, where eventually when I ask the question, have you read the textbooks on the topic? And the answer is no, is appalling. So, like, this is something that I can't emphasize enough, right? We don't need to do original thinking here to begin with, right? We are not going to sit around and originally solve these hard, complicated problems that other stalwarts of the industry who are far greater than us have spent decades trying to solve. Everything from org design to software engineering, interview loops, branding, like, my list is endless. But in every one of these areas, what I found was that I was trying to solve something, through original thinking without the necessary experience. And that I could have got all of that just by picking up a couple of textbooks and reading. And eventually, in multiple areas, we've actually had a lot of success simply by applying the textbook, from everything from being able to deliver software with 1/10 the headcount, to delivering marketing that's well positioned and bringing in talent, to tuning our interview loops. All of these have been affected by the books. The other deeply understudied, undervalued approach is a very simple one: model and watch your cues. What I mean by this is, our work is just filled with all of these cues where work piles up, where someone has to address something and then move it to someone else. And we almost never model these. And queue length is the single most powerful control lever you have on your execution. Like, recently, I remember I was having a conversation with someone on my team about whether we should specialize on front end. And it's a very early stage project, super green field. MVP isn't out yet for internal consumption. And, my argument over there was very simple. If I have front end and back end, I have two queues. And the product did not have sufficient complexity to justify requiring deep front end or deep back end specialization. And if I did not need that specialization, why would I trade off the overheads of a second queue? And if you take the time to go read the section on queues in Reinertsen's book, you will see the amount of difference, and it's orders of magnitude of difference with every stacking problem, that your execution slows down with additional queues. So, if there is one control lever that you want over your execution, it is modeling your queues. And modeling this is hard, going back to my previous point. because we don't instrument. So this is something that, doing over again, or where I do fresh, I now try to track. Next useful thing that I've found is there is always a domain specific wiki for every function of different qualities. Examples of this are GitLab, GitHub, and Abstract. Basically, what these are wikis that are completely specialized for the workflows of a certain function or specialization. And they offer processes and tooling to make that workflow easier, faster, better. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, what they are is a wiki. They offer you versioning of artifacts. They allow you ownership of artifacts. They allow you to maintain a history, and they allow you to track relationships. So there is always a wiki. If you're general managing, you probably want a plain text wiki. But if you're specialist managing, then you probably want a specialist wiki. Go look for it. It exists. One could even argue that most of our project management tools are specialist wikis, like Asana and Jira. But that's the idea. So that's my set of operational suggestions on execution. A couple of closing comments, and I think we can move to a more free-flowing conversation. I've just given 3 pithy quotes from 3 of my colleagues. There are others, but I decided to choose these 3. One is Ajay's rule, which seems like it's unrelated, but I found has all sorts of interesting side effects to both alignment and execution, both, which is earn people, not money. If you focus on making sure that the people you work with trust your principles and have reason to understand why you do what you do and can rely on you, you will find that alignment speeds up and execution speeds up. Akash's rule, this is actually a queue length execution rule, a dependency management rule. Golden one, most egregiously violated, though it's so simple. If it isn't in production, don't depend on it, right? Simple rule. If it is, and every time it's been ignored, there has been a world of pain, right? Don't create a plan which depends on someone else's plan, because their plan depends on someone else's plan, which in turn depends on someone else's plan. And if you're big enough, this chain can come around and bite you back, and you've got a closed loop, right? And the last one is, Niranjan's rule, which is always be 2 weeks away from a ground up rewrite. There's a little bit of nuance here, I would say, which is that this is pre-serious product market fit. This was extremely important for us in the early days, because at the rate of growth we were seeing, there was no engineering subsystem we had which lasted more than 6 months. The typical half-life was like 3 months. In 3 months, whatever you built had to be completely rewritten, because the overall traffic has doubled 3 or 4 times since it was originally written. So this is a golden rule from yet another golden rule. Make sure you run your projects in such a way that every artifact that you need in order to rewrite the entire subsystem is always available. Because when you are in this phase, your effort is not going into writing the code. It's going into figuring out what code to write. If you are maintaining those artifacts in GitLab, in your wiki, in Abstract, wherever, in such a manner that the moment you take a call that, okay, we've hit product market fit, let's pay off tech debt, you can in 2 weeks go from, you completely reboot the whole code base and pay off that tech debt. Because the worst thing you can do is to take a system loaded with debt that you have used to hit PMF and then try to use that same system to continue scaling further, right? Again, very easy to say, very hard to do. Like I've been on multiple projects where I can tell you for sure there's no way we maintain the artifacts needed to reboot from ground up in 2 weeks. But this is something that I've tried to be more disciplined about in the recent past. So yeah, that's my talk. I think we can switch over to
Thank you so much, Sidhu. Very relatable. Couldn't agree to the things that you spoke, especially about the writing part, which even I personally learned so much during the last few years at Gojek. As the team scales, as the product scales, you start realizing that there's so much that you can do just by written communication.
Yeah.
Maybe we are just getting old and now get understanding the importance of it, and we are realizing it's not just bureaucracy. So let's move to questions. I request everybody to post your questions on chat. We can start with Pranay's question. Pranay, would you like to ask your question?
Hey, Brooks, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yeah, so Sidhu, thanks for the talk. Primarily wanted to understand regarding the point you made around how do you produce quality blog around products, right? So
Yeah.
this has been something which we also want to do. As in, wanted to understand like in more details, what trade-ups do you follow, or like is every team member asked to blog at a certain time, or what sort of note-taking mechanisms you use? Any sort of detail would be great.
So there are, I would say, two or three different ways, different axes along which the problem needs to be attacked. Right. The first is the barrier to entry on writing itself. Like writing is hard. The second is the barrier of editorial. Sure, someone's produced content, but all content needs editorial to be of sufficient quality. So you don't want to wind up in a situation where someone is taking the initiative to write content, but because there is no editorial, either you ship that content as it is and it has a negative effect, or you don't ship the content and then the person's demotivated. So you need to make sure that there is editorial support, right? And the third thing, very honestly, is if it matters, it should be in the performance review. Like this is a golden rule operationally, right? Like if it matters, it's in the performance review. It's not in the performance review, it does not matter.
Sure.
So one of the things we very clearly saw at Gojek was we developed a capability matrix for folks as we scaled up. And one of the things that we put in there was one track for recruiting, which means that, you know, if you're a member of the team, you need to be contributing to recruiting. And one part of that was, of course, participating in panels and, you know, putting in the effort to give candidates a good experience. But another part of it was inbound recruiting, which is content production, writing blog posts, et cetera, et cetera. That had a huge positive impact on driving content creation. But to summarize, one, you need to make it lower the entry barrier to writing itself. The second is you need a editorial team that can work. And I found that my experience has been that the best people for the job are obviously journalists, right? Because this is what they do day in and day out. So at Gojek, what we've built is there is a team that consists of people with from journalism backgrounds who work very closely with all of the delivery folk to make sure that the content is at at the same bar with the same tone with the right quality. So I would say these are the three pieces that need to be put in place.
Cool. Thank you.
Siddharth sir.
Hey, Sidhu. Thanks for the amazing talk.
Thanks, man.
My question is very simple. How do you measure developer productivity or team productivity?
Yes, the simplest questions are the most difficult, right? Okay. So as usual, caveats apply, YMMV, etc., etc. This is how I do it. May not work for you. Hard problem. My playbook is straight out of Lean software and PopInDX Lean software and Guy Knudsen's Principles of Product Development Flow. My most basic framework is to have a consistent short iteration and to have work throughput measured first in terms of the number of cards going out. I don't fuss too much about what goes into a card. And then slowly refining that out until we are down to an economic unit like story points. Like I generally use story points as a currency to track productivity. And I want to flag that there is, I don't think, a meaningful way to compare the productivity of two teams. All of the measures of productivity are not to compare teams against each other because that's pointless. It is to compare a team against itself so that you can optimize throughput. But I don't have a good solution to comparing across teams. I've got a blog post on this. I can post a link later with which has like a 3 or 4 page framework talking about how I measure this.
A related question. There are a number of services that will read your Git log and tell you about all of these things that your developers have been doing.
Yeah.
Do you use any of them? Do you find any value in them?
Look,
you know what I'm talking about, right? Git Prime and so on.
I mean, I've never used any of them, but to be honest, but I'll tell you the metrics I look at off the repo, right? If I take GitLab, I have a little bit of scripting that pulls all the data off the APIs and dumps them in a DB so I can run queries on them. And primarily what I look for is staleness of commits from production, staleness of branches, if we are using branch-based. I look at the gap between commits, and I look at the number of changes in a particular commit. And I look at the trends across all of these to try to keep an eye on things and make sure that things aren't going awry.
Cool, thanks.
Ankur?
Thanks, Diwakar. Hi, Sidhu.
Hi, Ankur.
My question is, since you have founded like a couple of startups, and I just wanted to know, when do you know that you have product market fit?
Look, honestly, most of the time when we had product market fit, I never realized at the time. I don't think there's an easy answer to it. It was always a case of, oh, we had PMF, oh shit, in hindsight. I think the one thing that you will see in consumer PMF and enterprise PMF is things suddenly seem easier than they should be. I'll give you concrete examples. When I was working, I had joined my school programming buddy startup straight out of work as employee, as a co-founder, as the first guy on board. And our first product was accounting on SMS, basically, just tracking your expenses, and that flopped. And after 3 months, we pivoted and we launched group chat on SMS. Closest equivalent was Twitter at that time in 2006. And we had 6,000 DAU in 2 weeks. Now, we didn't do anything different. It just happened. RubyMonk was the same thing. We basically just wound up with like 50,000 actives in like 3 days. Gojek, I've seen the same thing happen as an employee. Even when we were doing consulting the first time around, again, that wasn't our focus area. We were trying to do product, but we hit PMF on consulting in 2010 because we were doing Rails consulting when it was just taking off, right place, right time. And we were doing $1 million run rate in 18 months without even trying. So my current heuristic for PMF is you haven't really changed anything, and suddenly things are taking off or feeling easy. And it's almost always a feeling that happens in hindsight. Like you're looking back and you're like, wait, why are we doing this much revenue, or why are the users this active in the last month or so, right? Unfortunately, the best answer I have is the one which they have around that, there's that famous judgment in the US, right? Which is, it when it, how do you know what is porn? You know it when you see it. That unfortunately is the place where I am in terms of saying, hey, I know PMF when I see it, and the way I can rationalize it is suddenly things feel easy. That's because you've hit an inflection point, something has changed, the step function kicked in, and suddenly you see things move up. And you will see this happen in steps, of course. I don't mean there's a one-time PMF and then you're done, but that would be the single thing to look for. Suddenly things are moving and you don't know why.
Thank you so much.
Nikhil?
Hey, thanks so much. Sidhu, that was amazing. Just wanted to sort of allude to the third part of the talk that you said you left out on the hiring front.
Yeah.
My question was on the framework, right? Like, how has your sort of framework evolved over the family stage, the tribe stage, and the city stage? And what do you sort of specifically test for, especially in a sort of a generalist role, especially in the product context?
Sure. The first thing is from family to tribe to city. So recruiting is both sales and marketing, right? Or if you want to call it that, it's inbound and outbound. Inbound is where people come in and apply to you because of your brand, your content, they've heard about you, they use your product, what have you. And outbound is where you go and reach out to people and pitch. Now, family and tribe should be entirely inbound, in my opinion. Like if I had to do it again now, I would not do any outbound hiring at family and tribe size. And it would be a considerable, but the thing is you need to gear up to shift over into outbound as you move into city size. Right? So that's the first thing I would say. That I'll include referrals into inbound. So family and tribe should be completely on inbound. but you need to start gearing up operationally for outbound. And outbound is operations, it's sales. It's just straight up hardcore pipelines, right? You need to have that pipeline there, every stage instrumented, candidate experience tracked. I would also say that you need to, in our markets, I'm not talking about other markets, but in our markets, India, Southeast Asia, you need to build your recruiting team in-house. There is no other way, both inbound and outbound. There is nobody in the market that you can outsource to who can do this for you. So the second thing there would be build your own team in-house. It is the right investment to make, right? If you're at family size, you should, the founders should be doing it themselves. Tribe size, maybe you've got somebody, but city size, of course, you're talking about a full-fledged, you've got an inbound team, you've got an outbound team, and the outbound team is a proper operational machine. In terms of selection criteria, I would say it's portfolio. Like, that always has consistently topped out in terms of the single strongest predictor of good fit. The portfolio of the person and their ability to talk about that portfolio in depth and to give you a balanced viewpoint. Maybe a few implementation examples of this is to, from an engineering standpoint, an example I can think of is to figure out, like, there is no good engineer who cannot crib for an hour about their favorite language. Their favorite language, not the language they hate the most, their favorite language, right? So the ability to give a balanced viewpoint about something you love, the ability to explain why a certain decision was made a certain way in a product or engineering or design contest, and sort of showing the process of, hey, in this project, I made this decision like this, but then the next project I learned from that and did this. Everything that you can figure out by talking to somebody in depth about their portfolio, that would be number one on my list in terms of criteria for fit. I would also say that there is, if you read Kahneman talking about interviews, right? There is some excellent material over there about why, and this has been a major change for me. Like, I came into Gojek treating interviews as an art form. Like, you've got to be a skilled interviewer, that you've got to, you've got to learn, like, you come up with creative questions in the interview. And now, like 4 years later, I'm just the exact opposite. I'm like, every interview, every round will have a standard set of questions. The interviewer does not decide whether or not to hire. The interviewer simply scores. And then the results of the scores are thrown into an, are computed, and that tells us the hiring decision. You never leave the hiring decision to a human, subjectively, in a given round. And you'll find all of this, if you just Google for Kahneman Israeli Army, that's the anecdote from his book. But that is the piece in a nutshell. Just look for Kahneman Israeli Army. But that applied to interviews is I would say, the other major change in how I approach things.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sidhu.
Sure.
Kaushik.
Hi, Sidhu.
Hey, Kaushik.
Amazing talk.
Thank you.
So very relatable for me. So I come from a very small startup which understood the importance of alignment and having a writing culture. And we got acquired by a 10x larger company where none of this is there, but they have amazing growth. And there's a lot of resistance to doing any kind of change. So from your experience, what can you tell about, like, bringing in a change agent, like bringing change when there's a lot of resistance for it?
I mean, look, the bitter truth is, I don't think there's any change which does not have a lot of resistance, ever, right, in any situation. I think the answer is very situational, but at a high level, I would break it down into two things, right? Now, there are two reasons why you would not adopt a new practice. One, you don't believe it works. And two, you don't have the competence to do it. These are the only two reasons. Now, both of these reasons can be both either conscious or subconscious, and it's different with different people, right? Like, you may not want to do something like a common trend that I see is continuous integration to master in engineering, where it puts a lot of psychological pressure on engineers who are not used to it, in terms of fear of their code being judged because it's half thought through, right? Now there is an inherent fear around judgment of capability, right? Whereas in other cases, you can talk to somebody about, pick another practice, silent meetings, take whatever, right? They may just not believe it works. Now, you need to figure out which combination of these are at play and with whom. Now, if for example, it's a senior leadership buy-in that you need, then you need to be able to prove that it works. There, the capability thing is not so much a matter, because it is not, typically it is not the capability of the senior leadership that is in question. Right? They are not sitting there worrying, can I write? Most senior leaders don't have that issue. Right? They obviously, just by being there, they have to do those things. The issue is more that they may not buy into its efficacy. Then the question becomes, how can you prove within your group that you are demonstrating a competitive advantage by having a better writing culture? Right? And you can also do this grassroots. Like in Gojek, the wiki culture was very grassroots. Right? Like it just became obvious that because all the teams end up having to talk to each other over something or the other, some API integration, something. Always there is something. And then they would start seeing, oh, the other team's maintaining this in their wiki. Okay, let's copy that over. So it's also possible to do that as a grassroots movement and then create buy-in for that. If there is a capability issue at the end of the day, that can only be resolved by bringing that into your performance management process.
Okay.
Like there's no other silver bullet approach that's possible. And even bringing it into performance management just means that it comes in as hygiene, right? Because now there is a formal expectation that, look, irrespective of anything else, this is the expectation. You need to do this. The second thing is it sets expectations with managers, saying that, you know what, if this is not done, it's not acceptable. So you will see me give this answer multiple times. If there is particular aspects of your operations or execution that you really, really need to make succeed, at the end of the day, it matters whether or not it's in your performance. If it is not in your performance management system, then almost every other initiative that you do is likely to fail.
Sure, makes sense. Thank you so much.
Utkarsh?
Yeah, thank you, Sidhu. Thank you for the talk. Okay, so I saw one of your earlier talks where you said that Gojek achieved a unicorn scale with less than 70 engineers and that decacorn scale with less than 300.
Yeah.
Can you tell me if this low number of engineers that Gojek is famous for, was this your choice or was it by design that you weren't able to have more engineers?
It's by the book. The answer is yes, it's by design. It's by design because it's from the textbook. I would also frame it more controversially, not in terms of us having a low number of engineers, but everybody else having an unnecessarily high number of engineers.
I understand. Thank you.
Amit?
Thanks, Sidhu. I mean, I still have some more left to do on your last statement. But so, I mean, as it is clear from my question, right, basically, many startups leave their culture to be figured out later.
Yes.
So what has happened to you? I mean, any experiences where like you had to do that as an afterthought, and between product and take, like, I mean, at least we have seen some.
That's a very interesting question. You see me nodding my head when you ask the question, but the truth is that my biggest problem in life was I didn't understand what the heck people meant by culture until just a couple of years ago, right? Now you have to understand, let me caveat that, right? Like I come from a background where, started out as deep engineer, just looking at everything that came out of an MBA textbook is nonsense. And probably the primary example of that is this word called culture that's used to justify all sorts of things. And then I think 2 or 3 years ago, I came across this marvelous definition, which really helped, which was, and it was culture defined through the lens of process, right? Now, process is every well-defined set of steps, which if executed, will almost certainly produce an output, right? High probability. It's a process. You do it, almost certainly, this output will be produced, right? And culture, so it's a decision-making system, right? And culture is how people in your organization make decisions when there is no defined process, right? Now, the reason culture matters is because process does not scale. I think we all understand this well. Process is a tactical tool that you deploy for very specific kinds of workflows. And that needs to be used with caution because too much process just doesn't work with human beings. And culture does, but then culture is hard to get a grip on because, well, how do you really how do you get people to make decisions when there isn't a process, right? Now, having called out that this is what I mean when I say culture, which is how do people in the company make decisions when there is no process to guide them? I think that we were pretty intentional about what we wanted our culture to be across the board from the get-go. However, if I had to do it over again, I think where we missed out on a lot of things was because we did not do so much writing in the beginning, anywhere close to as much writing in the beginning. All of our culture was tribal. And as we scaled to city size, we started finding it fragmenting, going piecemeal. And one of the biggest gaps there was the lack of writing. And as we shifted into becoming a more writing organization, I could see some of those close. But by then, honestly, there was too much already in place, too much momentum, and it becomes hard to reverse that. So I think it was less, very intentional about our culture. Yes, very much. I think the thing that we missed was how quickly and easily it would fragment.
Thanks much. I think, that surely clears it up.
Molly, can you ask a question?
Hey, Sidhu, thanks. Thanks, DK. Quick question from C42 going into Gojek, right? C42 was a boutique product engineering org, like you put it, which still meant that you were working for a client. And a client wanted you to do some stuff, and then you did it for them.
Yeah.
I'm trying to put that into the context of where we were we're still there. If you're doing enterprise SaaS and you have one large client, you're pretty much doing what C42 were doing at that time, maybe. Yeah. And going into a heavily product related org like Gojek, where it's no longer something where somebody's going to ask you for something and you got to do it. What were the things that you had to change, your mindsets, your frameworks? Can you give a very brief overview as to the changes that you had to get yourself through?
I think the single biggest thing was I was a terrible follower. Like, I definitely drunk the leadership Kool-Aid, and I wanted to, obviously, I had the founder bug and I wanted to be a founder and all of that stuff. But I think what I totally was blind to was the fact that I just did not understand what it meant to follow. Right. And I think one clear takeaway from me is you can't lead well if you can't follow well. Right. It's impossible to be you lack a good mental model for how to make people who you're leading effective and productive if you don't know how to follow well yourself. I think that was one definite takeaway. The second one was I think the early days, the period that this talk covers was not too much of a friction because we had almost no specialization. It was just whatever problem was there, we picked up, right? Whether I've seen product managers coding, I've seen engineers writing specs, those boundaries were very blurred. One thing that I've struggled to adapt to is as you scale, you need to increasingly specialize roles. Even the idea of a role is something that I would have fought against 3 or 4 years ago that I now understand is important to integrating a larger organization. So increased specialization of functions and roles and the consequent increased challenges of alignment and skin in the game are probably the second major area of adaptation for me. So I would say those are 1 and 2. Like become a better follower and understand how to manage specialization in the organization.
Cool, thanks.
Hardik?
Hey, Sidhu. Great. So simple question again, output to outcome alignment is critical, and that is what you suggest, and org design can help drive that. But typically where the P&L responsibilities are aligned versus people who are shipping actual stuff are different levels, right, in an org design. So how do you align that, and how do you motivate engineers to care for business outcomes? Something might kind of work for you.
Basically, so I don't have very well-formed thoughts here. What I have to offer is probably very counterculture. I think that pairs and triumvirates are deeply underappreciated leadership structures. I think that organizations converge on single leaders in order to create accountability. But I've always wondered, what does that mean? Because, if you take a founding team as an example, all the founders sing together or swim together. So why is it different for a team, where the leadership is, say, product management and engineering? Why can't I hold the product manager equally accountable for a downtime as I hold the engineering leader? And why can't I hold the engineering leader equally accountable for, a poorly researched feature that totally flopped, for very obvious reasons? If they're a team, then I should be able to hold them jointly accountable. Yes. Now, the reason I bring this up is, the moment you start segregating in a functionally specialized situation, the moment you start drawing that P&L boundary on one side or the other, you run into the skin in the game problem. And I tend towards the argument that I would rather deal with the complexities of having a pair in leadership and holding both of them accountable simultaneously, rather than deal with the consequences of no skin in the game on one side.
Mm-hmm.
And I have personally seen in Gojek in multiple cases, pairs and triumvirates being extremely successful, stable leadership structures. Yet I understand that, and of course, a lot of this could be my own ignorance, right? That maybe, if I start working with organizations of 5 or 10,000 people, I will figure out why it doesn't work. But I can tell you that, historically in Gojek, pairs and triumvirates have been surprisingly stable. And I would reach for that structure to hold accountability while maintaining skin in the game. Like I would put P&L on the head of engineering as well.
Okay, thanks.
Like the question I would ask is, at what level of seniority does the P&L hit the engineer, right? Because for a product manager, the P&L should hit pretty early, right? Like I like to joke about this. There's no such thing as a junior PM, right? There are only senior PMs. Everybody else is either an engineer or an analyst or a designer or, somebody who aspires to become a PM. There's no such thing as a junior PM, right? Because a PM has to cover such a wide gamut.
Right.
So with PMs, it's always intuitively easy. No one pushes back saying why, PM needs to have P&L. Yes. But when I say, hey, what's the difference? Like if a team is led by the PM and the senior engineer, then I want joint accountability for P&L on both, and let the two of them figure it out.
Right. So do you kind of inculcate this as a part of the performance management typically? Because what happens is that while you're evaluating the people who are shipping stuff, you might be focusing on their output versus it's not easy to link it, right? I mean,
so this has been one of the areas where we've had a lot of challenges, to be very forthright. And one of the things that I would attack or do differently, doing it again, would be to have a very, we never had a common structuring across functions in Gojek until very recently. And I think that's something that I would now try to do somewhat earlier, probably early city stage, right? Which is to say, if you're broadly at the same level of complexity of problem, I'm going to hold you accountable for P&L. Like I don't give a, I don't care what function you come from. I don't care whether you're a data scientist or a designer or an engineer or a PM, right? If you're at that level of complexity and you're on a team, then everyone at that level is jointly accountable for P&L, and I will treat you as a unit. And that is usually very, very senior, just to be clear. Like you're talking about, a group level. I don't mean a team of 5 people. I'm talking about like where the group has at least 50, 60 people in it, multiple tech leads, multiple design leads, multiple senior PMs. And then there is a group PM, group engineering lead, group design lead sitting on top of it. At a group level is where I would start considering putting in P&L.
Interesting. That helps you. Thanks.
So, Sidhu, we'll have just maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Gaurav?
Sure.
Hey, Gaurav, you want to ask the question? If you're speaking, we can't hear you. Maybe you're on mute. So the question Gaurav has written is that how important is open culture for young engineers and PMs, and is it practiced in Gojek?
That depends on what you mean by an open culture. So, Look, family size, extremely high transparency produces phenomenal output. And outcomes, of course, depend on your discipline and quality, but output, high level of transparency and openness does. Tribe level, a good amount of openness, but then it puts a huge burden on people perceived as leaders to make sure that that openness is not leading to issues of alignment. But as you scale beyond a certain headcount, it simply becomes impossible to expect a mature, balanced reaction from every single person in the company for two reasons. One, either they don't have enough information to form a balanced judgment of an issue that they're exposed to, or two, they lack the maturity to make a balanced judgment of an issue they're exposed to, right? When you're family or tribe sized, you can make sure that everyone that's joining the team is high maturity. You can make sure that everyone has access to all of the information. But as you grow beyond a certain level, that's no longer possible. And at that point, it becomes very, very important that there is an intentional decision made around what kind of information is transparently available and what isn't. You know, I started this journey, for example, as an advocate of complete transparency on salaries. And now I would strongly advocate against it, because I was trying to use salaries as a proxy for equality, but it turns out that compensation is not a good proxy for equality, right? You need to find some other proxy. I don't have easy answers there, but trying to do that with salary beyond a certain scale is just a recipe for disaster. There is a very specific, term here that I came across in a VGR article that I think was especially relevant. It was called status illegibility, right? I just drop it into chat, please look it up. But you know, one of the things that I ran into was attempts to create very high transparency and openness without a clear business objective can backfire in weird ways due to human nature and the complex dynamics that come out of large groups of people interacting. This was one such example. So please take a moment to read up on this, and you may find it interesting. But I would say that beyond city level, absolute openness does not scale. It actually causes a lot of alignment issues, and it requires enormous thoughtfulness as to figuring out what information goes to whom, where, when, how, and what are they doing with that information.
So folks, one more thing about Sidhu is that he reads a lot, like a lot. So Sidhu, I wanted to ask you one question, that in this new world order, if we may say so, what are some of the top science fiction books that you would recommend all creators of products to read to give them a better understanding of what the world could be or what they could make of the world?
Oh, both a curveball and a favorite topic. I'm going to have to think about that one. I think the most recent interesting one was this guy's book, Fall. Sheesh. What was the name? Full name? Very famous one. Crap. I forget the full name of the novel.
Camus.
Neil Stephenson. No, Neil Stephenson. Fall or Dodge in Hell. Right. There's I mean, it depends on how deep you want to go, but this is one interesting one. The other one is Asimov's Naked Sun, which is simply interesting because it's set in a culture where everyone is so paranoid about, they're such germophobes that they no longer meet in person. They only do remote calls, right? And the other one would be, it's probably 20 years old, probably getting a little stale, but freely available. You'll always hear me recommend this, Accelerando.
Fall, freely available, and Naked Sun.
Yeah, so I have put it all on chat. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sidhu. This has been brilliant.
Not at all. Thank you for having me, DK. This is an amazing thing that you've built.
Can we have a big round of applause for Sidhu? The max we can do is just unmute and clap.
Cool. Thanks so much. Yeah, but follow-on questions or conversations, I'm always available on Twitter. That's the easiest way to reach me. So please don't hesitate to hit me up there. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to run this talk past you. And I'll flesh it out, and hopefully I'll have a more mature version next time around.
Okay, thank you very much once again. Everybody have a nice Sunday. Stay home with your family or wherever you are, and stay safe. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Sidhu, maybe you can stick around for a minute. Once everybody leave, we can have a chit chat.